The moment Damien Cole spotted her at the back of the cathedral, the "I do" died in his throat. Queen Esther stood framed by the arched doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun, wearing a sleek black dress with spaghetti straps that didn't apologize for anything. She wasn't supposed to be here, certainly not at the wedding he had designed specifically to showcase her failure. "Damien, what is it?" Ava Cole whispered, her fingers trembling against his sleeve as she sensed his sudden, rigid tension. "Nobody," Damien hissed, his face a mask of shocked agitation. "Just someone from before." But Esther wasn't looking at the groom. Her eyes were fixed on the silver-maned man moving through the pews with the predatory grace of a shark. Gun Jun Pyo, the Korean billionaire mafia boss whose signature on a single document could make or destroy empires before breakfast, ignored the mayor, the tech moguls, and the stunned groom. He crossed the entire venue and stopped in front of Queen Esther like she was the only person in the room. 4 years ago, Damien had told her that investors don't bet on partnerships. They bet on one face, one story. He had stolen her algorithms, erased her name from their patents, and left her with a divorce settlement he thought was worthless. He didn't know yet that the one face, the world's most dangerous investor was about to bet on wasn't his, it was hers. Hello, family. Welcome to Afro Soul Mafia Stories. Before we proceed to the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comment section and also subscribe to this channel. Thank you. Now let's continue with the story. The warehouse smelled like burnt coffee, ozone, and the quiet desperation of 17 startups fighting for air in a space made of converted storage units. It was 2:00 in the morning, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, irritating buzz that matched the static in Damien's brain. He sat staring at his laptop, the blue light washing out his features and highlighting the growing panic in his eyes. "It's not working," Damien muttered, his voice cracking in the hollow silence of the room. He rubbed his face with both hands, his skin feeling like sandpaper. "We're hemorrhaging money on inventory that doesn't move, and we're losing the few customers we have because we can't get them what they need fast enough." He looked like a man drowning in his own ambition, watching the future they had dreamed of slip through his fingers. Queen Esther looked up from her own screen. Her natural hair was pulled back tightly in a silk scarf, her eyes tired but sharp as a blade. While Damien focused on the failure, Esther was already looking for the pattern. She didn't offer empty comfort or platitudes, she offered a solution. "Let me see the flow patterns," she said, her voice calm and steady, a direct contrast to Damien's frantic energy. She pulled his laptop toward her, her fingers flying across the keys with a rhythmic precision that Damien could never quite replicate. For the next 3 weeks, the warehouse became her world. While Damien spent his days trying to charm small-time investors and pacifying angry vendors, Esther stayed buried in the architecture. She existed on lukewarm espresso and a singular focus that bordered on the divine. She was building something nobody else in those 17 startups had thought possible. It wasn't just a logistics program. It was a prediction engine that learned from the very chaos that was currently destroying them. She treated the movement of goods like a seamless choreography, turning the nightmares of supply chain delays into a beautiful, predictable dance. "Look," Esther said one evening, her voice barely a whisper. She beckoned Damien over to her desk, where a series of complex data visualizations were moving in perfect harmony across the screen. Damien stood behind her, leaning in close. As he watched the test run, the realization of what she had achieved began to sink in. The system wasn't just fixing their current problems, it was anticipating them before they even occurred. It was a masterpiece of logic and intuition. "This is incredible," Damien breathed, the light from the screen reflecting in his wide eyes. The weight that had been crushing his shoulders for months finally lifted. He looked at the girl he had married, the woman who had just saved his life and his company. "Esther, you're a genius." She tilted her head back, offering him a tired, genuine smile. "We're a team, Damien," she replied, reaching up to squeeze his hand. "That's what makes it work." In that moment, Damien pulled her close and kissed her, tasting the bitter coffee on her lips and the sudden, overwhelming surge of hope. He felt invincible. He looked at the screen and then back at her, and for a fleeting second, he saw the future they were building together. But as he watched the engine run, the engine that Esther had breathed life into while he had merely watched in awe, A small, dark seed of ego began to take root. He saw the genius of the code, but he also saw the story he could tell the world. He saw the singular vision he would eventually claim as his own, while the true architect of their empire remained in the shadows of the warehouse, content to let him be the face of her brilliance. He didn't know then that he was looking at the woman who would one day reclaim her throne, or that this very engine would be the instrument of his public reckoning. For now, he just watched in awe, standing in the presence of a queen he didn't yet realize he was about to betray. The first investor pitch should have been their shared moment of triumph, the culmination of those endless, caffeine-fueled nights in the warehouse. Queen Esther stood backstage in the dimly lit wings of the auditorium, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She adjusted Damien's silk tie one last time, smoothing the invisible wrinkles on his expensive lapel, her fingers steadying him as she always did before important meetings. In her other hand, she clutched her laptop, the one loaded with her notes, her diagrams, and the intricate architecture of the flow engine that only she truly understood. "You ready?" she whispered, searching his eyes for the partnership they had built in the shadows. "We're ready," Damien said, flashing her a practiced, confident smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But when the heavy curtains parted and the bright stage lights hit, the we dissolved into a singular. Damien walked out onto the stage alone, leaving Esther standing in the velvet darkness of the wings. She watched through the gap in the curtain as he strode to the center of the podium, silhouetted against a massive screen displaying her life's work. "Good morning," Damien's voice projected across the room, booming with a charismatic certainty he had never shown in the warehouse. "I'm Damien Cole, and I'm about to show you the future of logistics." In the back row of the auditorium, where she had slipped in to watch from the shadows, Esther went very still. She watched, paralyzed by a creeping chill, as Damien began the presentation. He spoke with a polished fluency, presenting her complex system as his personal breakthrough, her innovative algorithms as his sudden stroke of vision, and her sleepless nights as his singular strategic foresight. To the room full of wealthy investors leaning forward in their chairs, Esther didn't exist. She was merely a ghost in the machine he was claiming to have built from scratch. Afterward, the air in the parking garage felt heavy and stagnant. Esther waited by their car, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder like a lead weight. When Damien finally appeared, he was loosening his tie, his face flushed with the high of adrenaline and the scent of success. "What happened in there?" Esther asked, her voice small but sharp in the concrete silence. "We killed it," Damien said, ignoring the look on her face. "They're interested. Real money, Esther, this could be it." "Why didn't you mention me?" she pressed, her chest tightening. "I built that entire system, Damien. I developed the logic you just sold as yours." Damien sighed, a patronizing sound that made her feel like she was being difficult. He turned to her, his expression shifting into the mask of the CEO he was becoming. "And you're a critical part of the team, Esther. Truly." He stepped closer, but the distance between them felt like a canyon. "But investors don't bet on committees or partnerships. They bet on a singular vision, one face, one story. That's how this works." "So I'm what? Your assistant now?" she asked quietly. "You're my wife," he replied, as if that title should be enough to compensate for the theft of her identity. "But when I'm up there, I need them to see confidence and certainty, not a committee." As they drove away from the venue, the city lights blurred through the window. Esther realized then that the warehouse hadn't been a beginning, but a hiding place. Damien didn't want a partner. He wanted a ghost writer for his legend. And as he talked excitedly about his upcoming Series A, Esther looked down at her hands, the hands that had written every line of code, and realized she was already being erased from her own life. The erasure was not a sudden event, but a slow, suffocating tide that rose year after year. As the company grew from a warehouse startup into a global titan, the narrative Damien had constructed during that first pitch hardened into an impenetrable wall of public record. Queen Esther watched from the periphery as the man she had once considered her partner became a fixture of magazine covers and late-night talk shows. In every glossy spread, Damien was framed as the genius founder, a singular force of nature who had looked at a broken industry and willed it into the future with his own hands. Esther sat through dozens of press interviews, perched on the edge of high-end sofas in skyscraper offices, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while journalists directed every technical question to Damien. Whenever she attempted to explain the intricate logic of the flow engine, the very soul of the company she had breathed life into, the reporters would smile politely, nod, and then turn their recorders back toward Damien for the visionary perspective. He never corrected them. Instead, he would lean back, adjust his cufflinks, and speak about his sleepless nights and personal breakthroughs, while Esther sat beside him, relegated to the role of the talented and supportive wife. Behind closed doors, the pattern was even more surgical. In board meetings, the strategic decisions that were born from Esther's data analysis were presented as Damien's gut instincts. She became a ghost in the halls of her own empire, the person people came to when they needed the system fixed, but never the person they thanked when the profits soared. She was the invisible architect, the one who handled the technical matters, while Damien handled the world. The betrayal reached its peak in the quiet, sterile offices of the company's legal department. Without Esther's knowledge, patent after patent was filed under Damien's name alone. He claimed the primary inventor status as a standard procedure of his role as CEO, effectively stripping her of the legal right to the innovations she had bled for in that drafty warehouse years ago. Every time she confronted him, the answer was the same. The company needed a singular face, a clear story, and a leader the market could trust. He told her she was being dramatic for wanting her name on her own work, even as he built a dynasty on the back of her silence. Esther realized that in Damien's world, there was only room for one star, and he had spent years making sure she remained nothing more than a footnote in his legend. The night Queen Esther discovered the truth, the silence in their sprawling suburban mansion felt heavy, like the air before a terminal storm. She sat at the mahogany kitchen table, the polished surface reflecting the harsh glow of the overhead pendant light, while a single manila folder lay open before her. Inside were the patent applications for the adaptive flow engine, the system she had coded line by line in a warehouse that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. She turned the pages slowly, her heart drumming a hollow rhythm against her ribs. She looked for her name, expecting to see it listed as the primary inventor, or at the very least, a co-founder. Instead, she found only one name repeated in the cold, legal typeface: Damien Cole. He hadn't just taken the credit in press interviews or investor pitches, he had legally codified her erasure. When Damien finally came downstairs for his morning coffee, the sun was just beginning to bleed through the designer curtains. He looked relaxed, the image of a successful CEO, until he saw Esther's face and the folder slid across the table toward him. "Explain this," she said, her voice sounding brittle and strange in the quiet room. Damien barely glanced at the documents before reaching for the espresso machine. "It's standard procedure, Esther. The company holds the intellectual property. I'm listed as the primary inventor because I'm the CEO. It creates a singular vision for the market." "I created that system, Damien," she countered, her voice rising with a mix of grief and fury. "I built every algorithm. I stayed up for 3 weeks straight solving the logistics nightmares while you were out networking. My fingerprints are all over that innovation." Damien turned to her, his expression shifting from indifference to a patronizing pity that cut deeper than an insult. "And the company will compensate you fairly. This is business, Esther. This is how we protect what we've built." "What you've built," she whispered, the realization finally anchoring in her gut like lead. She saw him then, not as the partner she had loved, but as a man who had treated their entire marriage as a long-term business heist. He hadn't just married her. He had recruited her, utilized her genius to build his throne, and then filed the paperwork to ensure she could never claim it. "Somewhere along the way, it stopped being ours and became yours," she said, her clarity returning with a cold, sharp edge. "You didn't want a wife, Damien. You wanted a ghostwriter who wouldn't sue." "Don't be dramatic," he snapped, turning his back to her. "I want a divorce," she said. The word hit the kitchen like a physical thing, shattering the domestic facade Damien had fought so hard to maintain. He finally looked at her, the mask of the confident visionary slipping to reveal a flicker of genuine panic, not because he was losing her, but because he was losing his most valuable asset. He tried to tell her she was just upset, that they could work through it, but Esther was already gone. She realized that if she stayed, she would continue to be work product, a footnote in his legend. To save her soul, she had to walk away from the empire she had built, even if it meant leaving with nothing but her name and the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The divorce lawyer's office was a tomb of glass and chrome, smelling of expensive air filtration and the cold finality of broken contracts. Queen Esther sat across from a man who had spent 30 years distilling human heartbreak into billable hours, and his assessment was as gentle as a scalpel. He told her she wouldn't get much. The patents were filed under the company, and every brilliant line of code she had ever written was legally classified as mere work product. Damien had built a fortress of paperwork around her genius, ensuring that when she walked away, she would leave behind the very empire she had breathed into existence. Esther listened to the legal jargon, the explanations of how fighting it would cost more than she could ever hope to win, and she felt a strange, icy clarity settle over her. She wasn't a litigator, but she was a master of systems. If there was a bug in the code of their marriage, she would find the exploit. She didn't want a long, public battle that would allow Damien to play the victim. She wanted a sleeper cell. When the final draft of the settlement was presented, Esther flipped through the pages with a practiced indifference, looking like a woman who had finally been defeated. Damien sat across from her, his posture relaxed, already projecting the image of the resilient bachelor CEO. He watched her pen hover over the signature lines, unaware that on the previous night, Esther had sat at her kitchen table until dawn, drafting a single, dense paragraph to be inserted into the final version. She had buried it deep within the document, Section 7, subsection C to a casual observer or a hurried junior associate. It looked like standard boilerplate fluff regarding ongoing utilization of proprietary systems. It was written in the kind of dry, academic legal language that made eyes glaze over instantly. But inside that linguistic thicket sat a poison pill. A contingent equity stake of 18% that would be activated upon any major capital event, including a Series C investment exceeding $50 million. Damien's lawyer barely scanned the page before nodding to his client. At the time, the company was hemorrhaging cash, surviving on nothing but hope and the stolen momentum of Esther's engine. To Damien and his legal team, 18% of a failing company was 18% of nothing. They saw it as a desperate, pathetic reach for a legacy that would never manifest. "Are we done here?" Damien asked, his voice lacking even a hint of the warmth they had once shared in the warehouse. "We're done," Esther replied softly. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name with a steady hand. She watched as Damien did the same, his signature bold and arrogant, sealing his own fate with the same ink he used to erase her. She walked out of that office with her dignity and a hidden clause that nobody thought would ever matter. She was walking into a 4-year silence, leaving him with the crown and the throne, knowing that she had left a timer ticking in the very foundation of his kingdom. She had bet on herself, gambling that her engine was as good as she knew it was, and that one day, a man like Gun Junpyo would come looking for the truth. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral didn't just open, they surrendered. The sound of the latch clicking echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted space, slicing through the soft organ music and the hushed murmurs of the wedding guests. Damien Cole, standing at the altar with his hand still hovering near Ava, turned toward the entrance with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The man who walked in didn't look like a wedding guest. He looked like the owner of the world. Gun Junpyo moved with a terrifying, predatory elegance, his dark suit tailored so sharply it seemed to cut through the very air. Behind him, 4 men in charcoal gray stood like silent monoliths, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, professional detachment that made the high society guests pull their shoulders in. Damien's face shifted from shock to a desperate, fawning smile. He stepped forward, leaving Ava at the altar, his hand outstretched. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the arrival of the legendary investor, the man who could turn his struggling empire into a global superpower. "Mr. Gunn," Damien called out, his voice slightly too high, too eager. "I'm honored you could make it. We were just about to." Junpyo didn't even look at him. He walked right past Damien's outstretched hand, his gaze fixed on a single point at the back of the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye in the cathedral tracked him as he bypassed the mayor, the celebrities, and the tech moguls who had been vying for his attention for months. He stopped in front of Queen Esther. She stood perfectly still, her black dress a shadow against the white floral arrangements of the church. For a long, heart-stopping moment, The billionaire and the ex-wife stared at each other. Then, Junpyo inclined his head, a gesture of respect he had shown no one else in the building. "I've been looking for you," Junpyo said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried to the furthest corners of the room. "The architect of the engine, the one who actually speaks the language of the future." "Mr. Gunn," Damien stammered, scrambling toward them, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "I think there's been a mistake. My ex-wife. She was part of the early support team, but the vision, the core logic." Junpyo turned his head just slightly, a cold, dismissive glance that silenced Damien more effectively than a blow. "I spent 3 months deconstructing your system, Mr. Cole. I looked for the mind that understood the chaos of the global flow. I found erasures in the metadata. I found digital fingerprints that didn't match the signature on the patents. I didn't come here for the face of the company." He turned back to Esther, his expression softening into something that looked dangerously like admiration. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I came here for the talent, the actual talent." Across the room, Ava stood alone at the altar, her white dress looking like a shroud as the guests began to whisper. The nobody ex-wife had just been validated by the most powerful man in the room, and the wedding Damien had built as a monument to his own ego was beginning to crack down the center. Esther didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just stood tall, her eyes reflecting the cold, brilliant light of a man who saw her for exactly who she was. The show hadn't just been stolen, it had been reclaimed. The murmurs in the cathedral grew into a restless tide as Gun Junpyo gestured toward the altar. With a subtle flick of his wrist, the massive projector screens, originally installed to display a romantic montage of Damien and Ava's journey to love, flickered and died. A heartbeat later, they roared back to life, but the soft focus photos of beach vacations and engagement rings were gone. In their place was a harsh, black and white interface bleeding with lines of raw, complex code. The guests gasped, craning their necks. To the socialites and politicians, it looked like a foreign language. To the engineers and investors in the front rows, it looked like the holy grail of logistics. "What are you doing?" Damien shouted, his face transitioning from a flush of embarrassment to the pale, waxy white of absolute terror. He scrambled toward the technical booth, but one of Junpyo's men stepped into his path, a silent wall of charcoal wool that Damien didn't dare push past. "This is my wedding. You can't just." "I am showing them the foundation of your fortune, Mr. Cole." Junpyo's voice cut through the air, cool and resonant. He didn't look at the screens, he looked only at Esther, as if ensuring she was ready for the world to see her soul. "Or rather, the forgery you built it on." On the screens, a cursor began to move with lightning speed. It opened the root directory of the original adaptive flow engine. A red box highlighted a metadata field at the bottom of the screen, author property. The name Damien Cole was there, but it was blinking. With a sharp click that echoed through the cathedral's speakers, Junpyo's team stripped away the top layer of the file. Beneath the clumsy digital overwrite, the original signature emerged in glowing amber text, property of Queen Esther. Final build, 02:14 a.m. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Every investor in the room knew that timestamp. It was the legendary night of the miracle, when the engine had supposedly been born from Damien's singular genius. But the screens were now scrolling through the source code, highlighting thousands of digital fingerprints, unique coding shorthand, specific syntax habits, and even a hidden Easter egg in the logic that spelled out Esther in hexadecimal. "Look at the logic, Damien," Esther said, her first words of the afternoon cutting through the tension like a diamond. She stepped toward the screen, her shadow stretching long across the altar. "You always hated the recursive loops in the third module. You told me they were too messy and tried to delete them. But without them, the engine can't predict the bottlenecks. You didn't even know how to explain them to the board last year, did you?" Damien's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He looked up at the screens, where his entire life's work was being publicly outed as a heist. He looked at Ava, who was shrinking back into the floral arrangements, her hand over her mouth as she realized the visionary she was marrying was a fraud. "You stole the glory," Junpyo said, stepping up to the altar, reclaiming the space that was meant for a union of lies. "But you were too arrogant to realize that the genius wasn't in the patents. It was in the hands that wrote the truth." Junpyo signaled his team again. The code on the screen dissolved, replaced by a legal document that made the room's air feel even thinner. It was the divorce settlement, specifically focused on a highlighted paragraph at the bottom of page 12. Section 7, subsection C, Junpyo announced to the stunned congregation. A clause that triggers a dormant equity stake of 18% upon any major capital event. Mr. Cole, you've spent the last 6 months begging my firm for a Series C investment. You told me the company was ready for the next level. Junpyo's eyes turned predatory, a slight, dangerous smile playing on his lips. I agree, it is ready. And as of 60 seconds ago, my firm has authorized a $65 million wire transfer into your corporate accounts. The capital event is complete. The screens flashed a bank confirmation. The audience erupted into a cacophony of whispers. They weren't just watching a wedding fall apart. They were witnessing a hostile takeover disguised as a romantic gesture. Damien's knees buckled. He realized too late that by seeking the billionaire's money to save his company, he had pulled the pin on the grenade Esther had left in his hand 4 years ago. The invisible architect was about to become the most powerful person in the room. The digital confirmation on the cathedral's screens wasn't just a receipt. It was a death warrant for Damien's autonomy. The silence that followed the chime of the completed wire transfer was so absolute that the distant sound of a siren outside felt like it was happening in another world. Inside the vaulted space, the atmosphere had shifted from a wedding to a corporate execution. Damien stood paralyzed. His hand still half extended as if he could somehow reach into the air and pull the $65 million back out of the ether. He looked at the screen, then at the rows of high-profile investors who were already whispering, their eyes darting between him and the ex-wife he had tried to bury. He wasn't a visionary anymore. He was a man who had just sold the controlling interest of his life to the woman he had robbed. The funds have cleared, Damien, Queen Esther said, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to the very back of the room without the need for a microphone. She stepped down from the shadow of the screen, moving toward him with a grace that made his expensive tuxedo look cheap and ill-fitting. The investment you spent 6 months begging for just triggered the one thing you spent 4 years trying to forget. Esther, wait, we can talk about this, Damien stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit, looking for a way out of a trap that was built of his own greed. This is a misunderstanding. The clause, it was just a technicality, a vestige of the old structure. It was justice, she interrupted, her eyes as cold and brilliant as the diamonds he had bought for Ava. You told me that investors don't bet on partnerships. You were right. Gun Junpyo didn't bet on us. He bet on the engine. And because of the clause in Section 7, that investment didn't just save your company, it returned mine. As of this second, I am the second largest shareholder of Cole Logistics. I own 18% of everything you thought you'd stolen. Gun Junpyo stepped forward, his presence expanding to fill the altar until the priest and the bride were nothing more than background noise. He adjusted the cuff of his dark suit, a slight, predatory smile playing on his lips as he looked at Damien. Technically, Mr. Cole, with the voting rights attached to my firm's new shares and Esther's restored equity, you no longer hold a majority. You are the CEO of a company that now answers to the woman you called nobody just 10 minutes ago. The congregation erupted. The tech journalists in the middle pews were already typing furiously on their phones, the blue light of their screens reflecting in their eyes like a digital wildfire. Ava Cole, standing in her white, strapless gown, let out a small, strangled sob. She looked at Damien, seeing the sweat beading on his forehead and the way his shoulders had slumped, and realized that the empire she was marrying into was a hollow shell. She was a queen of a kingdom that had just been annexed. This is my wedding, Damien suddenly roared, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim the narrative. He turned to the guests, his face a mask of agitated fury. This is a private event. Guards, remove them. But the security guards, men who were paid to recognize power, didn't move. They looked at Gun Junpyo, then at the charcoal-suited monoliths standing behind him, and stayed exactly where they were. The power had shifted so completely that Damien's commands sounded like the cries of a child lost in a storm. Esther walked up to the altar, stopping inches away from the man who had erased her name. She didn't look at his anger. She looked through it, seeing the fear underneath. You wanted to humiliate me, Damien. You wanted me to sit in the back and watch you start a new life on the back of my work. But you forgot one thing about the engine I built. She leaned in, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that only he and the billionaire could hear. It doesn't just predict logistics, it predicts failures in the system. And you, Damien, were always the biggest failure in mine. She turned away from him, leaving him standing at the altar of his ruined wedding, a groom without a crown. She looked up at Gun Junpyo, and for the first time that afternoon, a genuine smile touched her lips. The invisible architect was gone. In her place stood a woman who had used his own greed to bridge the gap between his theft and her triumph. The hostile takeover wasn't just of a company. It was the total reclamation of her life, executed in front of the very world that had been told she didn't exist. Under the high, cold arches of the cathedral, Queen Esther finally took her seat at the head of the table. The chaos behind them was a discordant symphony of shouting reporters, crashing floral arrangements, and Ava's rhythmic, hysterical sobbing. Damien stood in the center of the altar, his arms hanging limp at his sides, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man who had watched his own shadow detach itself and walk away. He was a hollow king in a ruined cathedral, surrounded by guests who were already deleting his contact information from their phones. The night air outside the cathedral was cool and sharp, smelling of damp stone and expensive perfume. As Queen Esther and Gun Junpyo reached the top of the grand marble steps, the flashbulbs of the waiting paparazzi erupted like 1,000 tiny stars. They didn't shrink from the light, they stood in it. "You didn't have to go that far," Esther said, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of the city. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had risked $65 million just to prove a point about the truth. Junpyo stopped at the edge of the stairs, turning to face her. The amber glow of the streetlights caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the predatory edge of the Mafia Billionaire into something far more human. "I have spent my entire career identifying value," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "Real value, not the performance of it. When I found your code 4 years ago, I didn't see a product. I saw a masterpiece. And masterpieces deserve to be protected." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And as for the rest of it, I've been half in love with the woman behind that code since the first time I saw the recursive loops in the 3rd module. Tonight just seemed like the right time to be honest about it." Esther felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, a bright, free sound she hadn't made since the warehouse days. "You're either very brave or very reckless, Gun Junpyo." "Can it be both?" he replied with a slight, dangerous smile. Before the stunned eyes of the wedding guests trickling out of the doors and the lenses of a dozen cameras, he leaned in. The kiss wasn't just a gesture of affection, it was a public coronation. It was the final, definitive seal on the transfer of power. In that moment, the black ex-wife, who was meant to be a ghost at the feast, became the most talked-about woman in the hemisphere. When they finally broke apart, Junpyo kept his arm draped firmly around her waist, anchoring her to his side. His driver pulled the sleek black limousine to the curb, the engine purring like a large, satisfied cat. One of the charcoal-suited men held the door open, his head bowed in a silent acknowledgement of the new hierarchy. "What happens now?" Esther asked, looking back one last time at the cathedral. Through the open doors, she could see Damien being cornered by 2 of his biggest investors, their faces twisted in fury as they demanded explanations for the metadata reveal. "Now," Junpyo said, helping her into the velvet interior of the car, "you go back to doing what you do best. You build things. You solve the problems that break lesser minds. You change the world." He sat down beside her, the door closing with a heavy, expensive thud that shut out the noise of the wreckage they had left behind. "Only this time," he added, taking her hand in his, "everyone in the world will know exactly whose name is on the front of the building." As the limousine pulled away from the curb, merging into the glittering stream of city traffic, Esther looked out the window. She watched the cathedral shrink into the distance, and with it, the version of herself that had been content to stay in the shadows. She took a deep breath, the scent of Junpyo's expensive cologne and the crisp night air filling her lungs. It didn't just feel like a successful business move or a lucky break. It felt like victory. It felt like home. Under the high, cold arches of the cathedral, Queen Esther finally took her seat at the head of the table. She was no longer the invisible architect. She was the queen of the empire she had built. If you enjoyed seeing the truth finally come to light, hit the like button and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were in Esther's shoes?